Hi, my name is Matthew Maerowitz, Managing Attorney of the Maerowitz Law Firm. Today I'm going to talk about setting aside a criminal conviction. What does that mean? So many people have been charged and convicted of a crime, whether it be a felony or misdemeanor. And setting aside is one of those ways to hopefully soften the blow of having a conviction on your record. Now, a lot of people have found that even an old conviction several years ago may still be negatively impacting them when it comes to applying for jobs, applying for professional licenses, an apartment hunt, housing, basically whenever a background check is run. And setting aside is one of those ways to hopefully minimize the impact, because instead of having a conviction on your record when a background check is run, it will show up as being set aside instead. Now, one thing I need to tell you right immediately is that setting aside a criminal conviction does not expunge your record. In other words, if a background check is run, even if your conviction is set aside, that doesn't mean the record is sealed. And a background check will still show that you have been charged with a crime. It will still show the case. But the difference is that once a conviction is set aside, it should no longer show up as being convicted. It'll show up as being set aside. And because what you're doing is setting aside a conviction, this doesn't apply to people who say, well, I want to seal my records. This doesn't apply to people who have already had a charge dismissed or been found not guilty. This only applies to convictions. And the reason is, if your charge was dismissed or you were found not guilty of a crime, then there's nothing to set aside. Because the whole point of set aside is that a set aside conviction should be treated as if you were found not guilty. It's intended to vacate the judgment of guilt. It's intended to treat the complaint as if it were dismissed. Now, there's some exceptions to that, but for the most part, it's supposed to soften the blow. So going forward in your life, your conviction will be set aside. It will no longer harm you going forward, so you can, and sometimes it makes the difference when it comes to job applications, applying for an apartment where a background check might be run. So just wanted to say that off the bat. Now, I did write about setting aside a criminal conviction back in 2015, and my blog post is still available at merowitzlaw.com. And the crux of my post is still accurate. You can still set aside a criminal conviction, but there's actually been a lot of changes over the years that have actually made it a little bit, I would say, more friendly for a defendant seeking for a fresh start in life, because now there are even more crimes, more convictions that are eligible to be set aside. And I'll briefly discuss about that. Back in 2015, the legislature basically expanded setting aside because certain convictions would affect certain civil rights, including firearm rights. And in 2015, getting a conviction set aside would also include restoring your firearm rights. So for certain convictions that affected firearm rights, you used to need to do a separate application to restore firearm rights, and for most cases, you no longer need to do that. It includes restoration of firearm rights. Now, not all convictions may do that for you, but that's one of the things that changed in 2015. Now, also, there used to be some traffic violations that were not eligible to be set aside. And just this year, the law changed so that I believe as of September 2021, there's no longer an exclusion of traffic violations. Another area, and this was around 2019 where the law changed, is that any misdemeanor where the victim was under 15 years of age, you could not, it was an absolute bar, you could not set aside your criminal conviction. And no longer is that a bar. Now, there still is an exclusion. You can't set aside a conviction if it's a felony with a victim under age 15, but the law has recently changed about a couple of years ago So for misdemeanors, that's no longer prohibition. So certainly the amount of convictions that are eligible to be set aside has expanded over the years. And in fact, now there is essentially only 3 convictions that are not eligible for set aside. And they mostly exist with felonies, although there is some exceptions. So the first one is any offense involving dangerousness you cannot set aside. And dangerousness is actually a legal term that applies to certain felonies where there will be an allegation of dangerousness. And if you're convicted of a dangerous crime, you cannot get your conviction set aside. The second conviction that's excluded from set aside are sex crimes. So crimes that involve either registering as a sex offender or that involve a finding of a sexual motivation. Any of those categories of sex crimes are not eligible to be set aside. Even if you've completed everything, all probation, you cannot set aside those crimes. And then there's the third and final crime that is a conviction that is excluded from being set aside, and I already hinted at this earlier, is felonies where the victim is under 15 years of age. There used to be more crimes that you couldn't get set aside, but now it's just those 3 areas that are excluded from set aside. Now, some people may say, well, if it doesn't expunge your criminal record entirely, what's the point? And my response to that is, well, why not? I would argue that it's much better to have your conviction set aside as opposed to having an active conviction on your record. And I've even had clients tell me that they were having difficulty with background checks, and then subsequently they get it set aside and no longer is there an issue. So certainly if you find yourself with a criminal conviction, even if it was years ago and it's affecting your prospects going forward in life, definitely it doesn't hurt to apply. It doesn't make the conviction any worse. If anything, it will soften the blow and minimize the impact it's having on you, because the whole idea is that sometimes you made a mistake in life and you shouldn't be penalized for the rest of your life as a result of this. Finally, with setting aside a conviction, there was a new law that was just implemented, and also I believe it took into effect just recently. I want to say September of 2021, and that is that under certain circumstances, if your application to set aside your criminal conviction is granted, you can also get a certificate of second chance. And in practice, we haven't quite seen exactly what this means, but under the law, it's supposed to be basically a certificate that employers have the same protections as if they hired someone that didn't have any criminal convictions. And it also is supposed to say that, well, for the purposes of certain licenses, this should have no effect on you going forward. So the certificate of second chance is basically you should be treated the same as everybody else, as if you didn't have this conviction. In practice, we haven't quite seen this work out yet, because I'm making this video within literally months of this law taking into effect. So we'll see how this works, but it's supposed to be an additional benefit of setting aside a criminal conviction. So if you have any questions at all, while this is normally a pretty simple process to do, and sometimes I'll even advise potential clients, well, this is something you can do on your own. But it might also be something you may want to hire an attorney like me who's experienced in helping clients apply to set aside their criminal conviction. But the initial consultation is always free. So if you have any questions at all about whether you are eligible and what needs to be done to set aside a criminal conviction, give me a call at 480-927-3700. Again, my phone number is 480-927-3700. I look forward to speaking with you.